Chapter 5. Spinning into darkness. Two policemen in black berets were chatting to each other at the entrance to departures. One rested his hand on the gun tucked into his belt, his fingers drumming lightly on the handle. Mr. Fix-It had trundled Mrs. Bancole's large maroon suitcase behind them. He pushed it to her now. Mrs. Bancole juggled with a matching small maroon box and a mock leopard skin coat. "This is as far as I come," he said smoothly. "Have a very pleasant journey, Mrs. Bancole." Then he beamed at the children. "Well, Yemi, Ade," he rolled their names loudly. "Be good now, and make sure you don't give your mother any trouble." Mr. Fix-It extended his hand to pat each of them lightly on the head. Sade had to restrain herself from flinching as his fingers brushed her hair. She saw Femi jolt, gritting his teeth. But when she glanced at the policemen, they were still busy talking. Inside the building, people in khaki uniforms with black berets were checking cases and tickets. But before they had even reached the queue, a figure in a sunny yellow agbada staggered backwards, almost stumbling over Mrs. Bancole's suitcase. A man with a telephone held to one ear was kicking Mr. Sunny Yellow and swearing. "Hey, hey, hey!" Mrs. Bancole's voice rose, but stopped swiftly. A large baton hung from the waist of the man with the telephone. "Security!" Mr. Sunny Yellow somehow swiveled upwards in an arc, curved around and ran off. Jutting his jaw out scornfully, Mr. Security returned to his conversation. When it came to their turn, Mrs. Bancole heaved the maroon suitcase onto the platform. Sade thrust their small brown holdall alongside it. Not bothering to compete with the surrounding noise, Black Beret pointed to Mrs. Bancole's case and imitated the turning of a key. He appeared bored as he observed her jewelled fingers struggle with the lock. But as soon as she pulled back the lid, he signed to her with a quick somersault of his hand. He wanted her to take everything out. Mrs. Bancole said nothing, but slipped a bangled hand into the side of her case. Sade thought she glimpsed the corner of her Naira note. After withdrawing her hand, Mrs. Bancole busied herself with her handbag. Sade watched the man's arm now slither like a snake down the same side of the suitcase. Then, casually, he lifted a few clothes before indicating with a tiny jerk of his head that Mrs. Bancole could close the case. His closed palm wove its way skillfully into his trouser pocket, and when his hand reappeared, it was open and signalled to the woman officer next to him. No words passed. She slapped labels onto both pieces of luggage. As if completing the silent dance, Black Beret and his companions swung the suitcase onto a conveyor belt behind them. The little brown bag followed, and within seconds both had disappeared through a dark hole in the wall. A narrow gate led to a couple of tall desks and more khaki uniforms. 3 gleaming brass buttons crested the shoulder of the man waiting for them. Again no words were exchanged as Mrs. Bancole produced her passport. Brass Button's eyes rested briefly on each of them before dipping down to study the little book and his computer. Mrs. Bancole's glittery green booba rose and fell steadfastly until Brass Buttons finally flashed back the passport, nodding them on. "What's that?" Femi broke his silence. His eyebrows and forehead puckered with suspicion. Ahead of them, a woman in a blue uniform was sweeping a thick black rod up and down people who had stepped through a metal door frame. It looked like some magic ritual. "It's to stop people smuggling," Sade said. "But we're being smuggled," Femi whispered fiercely in her ear. Mrs. Bancole swung around, her face issuing a stern warning. "Ade, my boy," she said, "take off your rucksack. Put it there, for X-ray." Femi folded his arms as if he hadn't heard. "Please." Sade stopped herself. Right behind them stood a man in dark glasses. He was wearing a flowing white agbada with a pattern of staring jet black eyes. Sade slipped off her own rucksack. "Shall I help you, Ade?" she offered softly. Femi swung the bag roughly off his back, just missing Sade before he slung it onto the conveyor belt. He was behaving like he did when he was overtired and no one could reason with him. "Doesn't he want to go on a plane?" drawled Mr. Agbadareyes. His accent was American, and the question was addressed to Sade, but Mrs. Bankole quickly intervened. "Children of nowadays, they take everything for granted," she exclaimed. "Aeroplanes are like fast cars to them." "Well, air power sure has helped make the world a smaller place. Just one big global village, ma'am." He swept a circle in the air with one arm, making the eyes on his Agbada jiggle. Once past the rod and the X-ray, Mrs. Bankole steered the children to a row of seats. Mr. Agbada's eyes followed them, keen to relate to Mrs. Bankole how this trip to Nigeria had been his lifetime ambition. "Tracing my roots, ma'am. Finding out where we black folk in America come from, you might say." Mr. Agbadareyes began to talk about stories of Africa that had been passed down through his granddaddy. Femi nudged Sade, pointing to the shops. Next to a window of cameras was an open kiosk with crocodile skins hanging down the side. Can we look over there? We won't go far." Sade couldn't bring herself to say a word like mother. Mr. Bankole hesitated, but Mr. Agbadareyes laughed. "Guess this old history is boring then." Mrs. Bankole's purple lips wavered before reminding them to stay in sight. Femi wrinkled his nose in front of the baby crocodile handbag. Its flattened head, with crazy paving patterns and sad empty eye holes, formed the front flap. "It's brutal, killing a baby crocodile," he announced, loudly enough for the kiosk lady to hear, although she pretended not to. The lady smiled at Femi. Why did so many grown-ups pretend and lie? But not Papa. And that's why Mama was... Sade slammed down the shutter in her brain. "I think it's horrible too," she replied clearly. Next to the crocodile bag were carvings of animals and a cluster of wooden heads. Many of the heads looked quite similar until she noticed the pair in the far corner. She studied the faces. The carved pattern of the woman's hair was so familiar. How like an older version of her own pair they were. Her own Oko and Iowo, stranded, deserted, on her desk at home. Impulsive hot tears pricked and burned. I need the toilet," she managed to whisper. Behind the closed door, Sade crouched on the seat, trying to contain the waves of sobs. Her hands over her mouth did their best to stifle them, but she was trembling as badly as one of those lemons that hung on so desperately when Mama shook the branch. Pulling the chain, she tried to drown her strangled cries. "Yemi, hurry up now! They've announced our flight!" It was Mrs. Bankole, sharp as any peacock. "I'm coming." Sade's lips mouthed the words. "Yemi, do you hear me? Yemi!" Forcing her legs into action, Sade undid the lock. "I felt sick," she mumbled feebly. For Sade, much of the journey was a blur. It was unreal. Yesterday evening, she had been at her desk doing her homework, like any other school night. Mama bringing her a chocolate drink before she went to bed, telling her that she shouldn't stay up too late. "Don't worry, Mama," she had replied. "Iowo is watching." It was a joke between them, that Oko and Iowo kept an eye on her for Papa and Mama. But tonight, what was she doing, looking at these rows of wooden heads in an airport kiosk instead of at her own Oko and Iowo? Who was this stranger, calling her Yemi, pretending to be their mother? Was this just a nightmare? Perhaps she would wake up in her own bed with Mama shaking her gently. "What's wrong, my child?" she would ask. "A bad dream?" Sade was vaguely aware of the air hostess, giving instructions about lifebelts and oxygen masks, of Femi fiddling with earphones and buttons, of roaring in her ears while she peered out into the night where shadowy shapes fell away beneath them. Somewhere, already far below, giant leaf plantains were whispering under the lamplight at the corner, and Mr. Abiona's old wooden table was tucked away for the night underneath the almond tree. Somewhere, their casuarina pines were spreading their needle-fine fingers against the sky and sending their scent into an empty room where a wooden girl with patterned hair watched over a vacant desk. But below them, all that could now be seen through the plain window was a scattering of pinprick lights surrounded by darkness. Soon those too had become fainter until there was nothing. It had been one of Sade's dreams to travel on an aeroplane. Papa and Mama had promised they would take them one day, but it was not meant to be like this. Tonight she was spinning into the darkness of space, let loose from almost everything and everyone she knew, except Femi, and he too was slipping from her fingers.